Empty shelves, no bread, no rice, no meat, not even canned food. The power's out. Supply chains have collapsed, and your family's at home hungry. What do you do? Most people have no answer, but your ancestors did, and it worked for over 300,000 years. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. For about 290,000 of those years, we lived as hunter-gatherers. No agriculture, no stored grain, no supply chains. Food came from the land directly every single day, and some days it didn't come at all. What's remarkable is that this lifestyle, brutal as it sounds, was in many ways more resilient than what replaced it. When the first agricultural societies emerged around 10,000 years ago, something unexpected happened. Famines got worse. Not because farming produced less food, it produced far more, but because it concentrated risk. A hunter-gatherer group facing a bad season could move, adapt, diversify. A farming village with a failed harvest had nowhere to go and nothing to fall back on. Entire communities starved in ways that mobile hunter-gatherers rarely did. Resilience isn't about having more, it's about how you relate to scarcity, and our ancestors had developed that relationship over hundreds of thousands of years. The last ice age was the ultimate test of that resilience. At its peak, around 20,000 years ago, temperatures were roughly 6 degrees Celsius colder than today. Massive ice sheets buried northern Europe, Asia, and much of North America. Sea levels were 120 meters lower. The megafauna hunter-gatherers depended on woolly mammoths, cave bears, giant deer were themselves struggling. Herds moved unpredictably. And yet, in the middle of all this, Homo sapiens didn't just hold on. They expanded, they crossed into Siberia, they reached Australia. They were, by any measure, thriving, while every other human species on the planet vanished. Neanderthals had larger brains than us. They were physically stronger. They had been living in Europe for 400,000 years. So what did Homo sapiens have that they didn't? Part of the answer lies in something archaeologists call dietary breadth. When conditions got hard, Homo sapiens ate everything that could sustain life. At coastal sites in South Africa dating back 165,000 years, during one of the worst climate downturns in human prehistory, archaeologists found evidence of shellfish consumption on an enormous scale. Middens, ancient rubbish heaps, filled with mussels, limpets, and sea snails. Not delicacies, survival food harvested in vast quantities when inland resources failed. The Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the few remaining hunter-gatherer groups studied today, demonstrate what this flexibility looks like in practice. During dry seasons when game is scarce, the Hadza shift almost entirely to plant foods, tubers, berries, and baobab fruit. They'll spend hours digging for a single root, reading signs in the soil that are invisible to outside eyes. When rains return and animals concentrate near water, they pivot back to hunting almost overnight. This isn't indecision, it's mastery of a different kind, the ability to hold multiple survival strategies simultaneously and deploy whichever the moment demands. But flexibility alone doesn't explain the Ice Age survival record. Something else was happening in the structure of how these groups organized themselves. Hunter-gatherer groups of this period were typically small, between 25 and 50 people, but they existed within much larger networks of connected groups, sometimes spanning thousands of square miles. These networks weren't just social, they were strategic. When one group hit a localized shortage, a drought, a migration shift, a disease that killed the local game, they could call on neighboring groups for food, for information about better areas, or simply for the right to move through territory that wasn't normally theirs. The more connected a group was to these wider networks, the more likely it was to survive climate shocks. Isolated groups showed higher rates of collapse during environmental stress. Connected groups, even in marginal environments, pulled through. Information traveled through social bonds. A group 200 miles away might know that a valley to the north still had game, that a particular riverbed still ran with fish, that a type of bark could be processed into something edible in an emergency. That knowledge only reached you if you had maintained the relationships that carried it. Successful hunters distributed meat widely, not just within their own group, but to neighboring ones. This looks like generosity. It was also investment, a reputation for sharing created obligations that could be called in when your own hunt failed. Alongside this social infrastructure, our ancestors developed something that may be the most underappreciated survival technology in human history: food preservation. The ability to transform a temporary surplus into lasting security, to take a successful hunt and stretch it across months of scarcity, was a genuine revolution in human resilience. At sites in the Levant dating back 11,500 years, before agriculture had fully taken hold, archaeologists discovered purpose-built storage structures. Not rough pits dug in a hurry. Actual buildings with raised floors designed to allow airflow, walls constructed to deter rodents, and layouts suggesting deliberate management of what went in and what came out. Communities were storing food on an organized scale before they had even committed to farming. In Arctic sites, meat was cached in permafrost, nature's own freezer. Evidence of drying and smoking points to the systematic production of preserved meat for journeys or lean times ahead. Fermentation appears to have ancient roots as well, the controlled transformation of food that extends shelf life dramatically while also adding nutritional value, discovered independently across multiple continents. These weren't desperate improvisations. They were technologies developed and refined over generations, embedded in cultural practice so they wouldn't be forgotten. And that brings us to perhaps the deepest layer of Ice Age survival, the role of culture itself. We tend to think of culture as separate from survival. Stories, ritual, the things you do when the serious business of staying alive is taken care of. But in Ice Age conditions, culture was survival technology. A story about a famine 3 generations ago, about which valleys still had water, which roots were edible when everything else failed, which signs in the sky preceded the hardest winters, isn't entertainment. It's a knowledge backup system that operates across time. It keeps critical information alive through generations of abundance, ready to be retrieved when scarcity returns. At sites like Lascaux in France, cave paintings created during the Ice Age show detailed depictions of animals, their anatomy, their behavior, the way they move. Some researchers believe these images serve partly as teaching tools, encoding information about prey species in a form that could survive the death of any individual who held that knowledge. Rituals around the hunt appear at sites across the world, easy to dismiss as superstition until you consider that the rituals often encoded practical knowledge: where to find animals at different times of year, how to read tracks, how to approach without triggering flight. The ritual was the packaging. The survival knowledge was the content. What ended the Ice Age wasn't something our ancestors did. Around 11,700 years ago, Earth's climate shifted rapidly, and they adapted to that too. The same flexibility that carried humanity through 20,000 years of brutal cold now carried it into an entirely new way of living. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. The people who painted those cave walls, who cached meat in the permafrost, who walked 200 miles to share food with a neighboring group, who encoded survival knowledge into stories around the fire, those people are us. Biologically identical, neurologically the same. Every capability they had, we have. What changed isn't our capacity, it's how rarely we're asked to use it. The knowledge our ancestors spent hundreds of thousands of years building still exists in fragments, in the margins of the modern world, in the last hunter-gatherer communities still living by those principles, in the archaeological record written in bone and ash and carefully carved stone, and somewhere in the inheritance that kept your ancestors alive through everything the Ice Age threw at them If you want to go deeper into these stories, the specific moments, the individual discoveries, the remarkable people behind each of these strategies, subscribe and hit the bell. Every episode goes further into what our ancestors actually knew and how they used it. Next time, we're looking at one skill that may have been more responsible for human survival than any other, and almost nobody talks about it. Thanks for watching Ancestor Tactics. Your ancestors didn't survive by accident, neither will you.